Good afternoon, and welcome to the Center for Disaster Philanthropy webinar, Race and Poverty, Connecting Disparities, Disasters, and Equitable Recovery. My name is Tanya Gulliver-Garcia. I'm the Director of Learning and Partnerships at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. My pronouns are she and they. I have over 30 years of experience working in Canada's homelessness and anti-poverty movement. My work at CDP combines my practical, academic, lived, and philanthropic understanding of disasters. And I ground my work in the principles of equity and an understanding of how the intersections of race, gender, sexual orientation, age, disability, class, etc., impact the lives of individuals, their families, and communities before and after disasters. So just a few housekeeping notes as we get started. You can submit your questions at any time during the webinar at the little Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We will answer them at the end of the panel presentation. At the end of the webinar, there's going to be a short survey. If you could please answer that to help us with our webinar offerings. And we are recording this webinar. It'll be available on our website and our YouTube channel shortly after the webinar is finished. But we have live captioning now in English and in other languages. Just click on closed caption or live transcript, and we'll have more accurate captioning after the webinar is over when we post the recording. I want to thank our co-sponsors, Alliance Magazine, Council on Foundations, Funders Together to End Homelessness, Giving Compass, National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters, Philanthropy New York, and United Philanthropy Forum. We thank all of them for their support because we couldn't do this without them. And then I want to acknowledge that CDP recognizes it works on the stolen lands of the many original peoples. We recognize that Indigenous peoples have been displaced and disenfranchised from their land by the socioeconomic and cultural impacts of colonialism and disasters. The erasure of Indigenous knowledge about how to care for these lands has caused environmental destruction and degradation. CDP is committed to dismantling the ongoing legacies, systems, and structures of settler colonialism, white supremacy, and their connections to philanthropy today and in the future. Despite centuries of theft, violence, and murder, this is still and always will be Indigenous land. Please join us in acknowledging the original peoples and their elders, past, present, and future generations. At the end of this webinar, our hope is that you will have a greater understanding of the interconnections between race, poverty, and disasters, that you will learn how philanthropy can help improve disaster outcomes by addressing the root causes of disparities, and that you'll be able to explore ideas for including an equity lens in your disaster giving decisions. And so I want to just take a look at the poll question. All right, so I know that many of you will say this is unfair for us to have you just answer one, but we wanted to see what folks thought was the biggest issue affecting someone's ability. And we can see that far and away, people have said socioeconomic status. So 75% of you answered socioeconomic, and then race is next at 14%. And then we go down and we have disability, family structure, mother tongue, age, and a few others. And then we're also going to talk about cash assistance during disasters, and a couple of the speakers are going to talk about that. So we wanted to see what the knowledge was there. And it looks like a little or some are the majority of the answers. So hopefully the discussions today will move us along a little bit further in helping you understand what cash assistance is and why it is so important. And then before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to provide a little bit of context. January is National Poverty Awareness Month, which is trying to raise attention and awareness about the growth of poverty. And poverty has some really weird definitions. So it's the total family income divided by the number of people that live on that income, and that equals the federal poverty level. So if your family income is less than the poverty threshold, you live in poverty. If your family income is greater than or higher than the threshold, you don't live in poverty. This does not take into account any other factors, such as loans or history or disability or race or home ownership or where you live. It's the same for everybody across the country. So the federal poverty level for 2024 is 14,580 for an individual and 30,000 for a family of four, and then in between for everybody else. And when we look at the numbers, this graph is showing us from 1959, when the US actually began recording about poverty, up to 2022. In the 1950s, the poverty rate was 22% and just about 40 million Americans living in poverty. So obviously, both of those have gone up and down. And in 2022, it was 11.5%. And 37.9 million people, so almost the same as it was in 1959. And the top states that are living in poverty are the top 11 are all in the South, beginning with New Mexico at 18.2% of the population living below the poverty line. But we want to also think about, as we had you answer that poll, about more factors than just poverty. And so when we look at these charts, we can see the way that poverty is racially impacted. And so white populations have less poverty than many of the other populations. When we look at Hispanic, Black, American Indian, or Alaska Native or multiracial individuals, the poverty rate is much higher, 1.5 times for Black communities and 2.2 times higher for American Indian and Alaska Natives. There's a higher percentage of women and girls living in poverty than men. Childhood poverty is higher than the overall rate. Family poverty is higher than family couples that don't have kids. Households led by a single mom is higher than all of those, but especially when compared to families led by single dads. And then all of this gets exacerbated when a disaster strikes. And we really rely a lot on research from Hunia Howell and James Elliott that shows us after a disaster, white residents accumulate more wealth than residents of color. And the bigger the disaster, the more wealth that they accumulate. And so that is both in the racial equity gap between the gain for one group and the loss for another, but also white residents compared to white residents in non-disaster or low disaster counties gain a lot of wealth. And so as an example, in Harris County, $87,000 difference. One of our speakers is in Harris County today, so I put this one up there, between the Black-white wealth gap. So white folks, this is Hurricane Harvey territory, have gained $87,000 in wealth. Home ownerships compared to renters, there's a $133,000 gap in communities that have had bigger disasters. And those that are college educated compared to those who have a grade 10 education, there's a $159,000 difference in areas that have had big disasters compared to smaller disasters or no disasters. So just a little bit of background, and then I really want to go into our speakers. I'm definitely looking forward to hearing some of them, or all of them rather. I know some of them for several years, and they are very powerful women joining us today. So Allison Cormier serves as a sales implementation manager, formerly the community engagement manager for Mobility Capital Finance, and you'll mostly hear us call that MoCaFi. It's a Black-led financial tech company whose work includes helping cities and community organizations across the U.S. provide digital payments to residents. And in her role, Allison ensures that payment programs are developed and managed efficiently. Prior to joining MoCaFi, Allison worked for Mayor LaToya Cantrell's administration in New Orleans as a neighborhood liaison, and she's a lifelong resident of the Gulf South. Ashley Gardier is the Executive Vice President at PolicyLink, where she guides the development and execution of programs to ensure that the 100 million people in America living in or near poverty, particularly those who also face the burdens of structural racism, can participate in a just society, live in a healthy community of opportunity, and prosper in an equitable economy. Also from New Orleans, Ashley was formerly the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at the New Orleans Business Alliance, which was the city's economic development agency. And I love this piece. Ashley has been recognized by Living Cities as one of the top 25 disruptive leaders working to close racial opportunity gaps. And then Kelly King Jackson is the founder of Kelly King Jackson LLC, a social impact firm that advises leaders and organizations committed to investments in Black women, girls, and femmes. For 25 years, Kelly's been in the social sector, having worked with both nonprofits and foundations. She has skillfully formed strategic partnerships, built effective teams, and funded Southern communities throughout her career. And her biography uses the word coach, loving disruptor, so another disruptive person, and resource liberator to describe her. And Kelly adds she's also philanthropy adjacent these days. So I am super excited to talk with all of you, and I appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise with the audience. So Ashley, I want to start with you. I shared some statistics, but tell me, why is the connection between race and poverty so significant in the US?
Mm-hmm. Well, good morning. And first of all, just thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be in these Zoom boxes with such an extraordinary panel of women. So in order to answer this question, we've got to go back and look at our nation's founding. It really does all start with the country's original intent. Our nation was designed for the success of white male property owners. It was an economic decision that we then built our government and all other institutions around. And so this is why we find that our democracy and our economy are inextricably linked. Both systems were designed to further the interests of just one particular group. Everyone who's been excluded from this group, so that's Black folks and brown folks and poor white people, have been struggling with the consequences of this flawed design since the nation's founding. And we feel it across our daily lives in every system that we encounter. So labor, education, housing, health, transportation, these systems do not serve all of us, and they certainly don't serve us well. As Tanya said, the disasters and our recovery efforts only exacerbate these inequities. Next slide, please. So in New Orleans, no secret, Black folks were suffering before Hurricane Katrina in an economy that did not serve them. And then Katrina hits. And even after $120 billion in federal investments were made to rebuild the region, the disparities didn't close. They didn't even hold. They got worse. So I share this slide. This is like the truth-telling slide. So many of us are like, if we just had more money, and I'm saying this because I was a funder as well, if we just had more money, we would do. This slide is just the truth. So our economy pre-Katrina was weak. We saw economic disparities among Black folks in employment. And we see the contrast with the experience of white folks in the city. Before the storm, 48% of Black men in the city were not working. And then after that $120 billion, 52% of Black men in the city were not working. Same thing with the wealth and business ownership gap. We went from, essentially the business receipts also decreased. And so for those of us who feel like if we just had more resources, we would do better, I think the lesson here is that it's the design from the beginning. Even when we make gains, we tracked everything. We saw the needle move. It's just that we saw it slide back over time. And again, that's only possible because the original design was never meant to include everyone. So we believe that the work of our generation no matter what seat we're in, is to redesign the nation so that it works for everyone. We've got to lean into the original promises of our founding documents. And at PolicyLink, we are a we're a research and action institute that really focuses on race and economic equity. We're leaning into the promise of all that we found at our founding. So that just to get us started, it was never designed to meet all of our needs. And so we've got to get busy about the work of redesign.
Thank you, Ashley. And I think this really aligns with the research of Hunia Howell and Jim Elliott in showing how these gaps actually get worse after a disaster. And that 52% statistic always gets me. Kelly, let's go to you next. So, we've been talking about this link between race and poverty. Our recent state of disaster philanthropy research showed that racial and ethnic groups only received about 20% of disaster funding after the disasters in 2021, even though we know, how high the needs are. So what strategies could funders use to increase their funding, before or out of a disaster?
Oh, thank you for the question. A few things come to mind. I specifically put this slide because as I was sitting on the Hurricane Harvey disaster relief committee, we had some really interesting conversations in the early days about making sure that equity was a strategy. And so we had funders from all different perspectives, frameworks who were coming to the table to say, we know everyone is impacted by this disaster, but also having to have the conversation that we knew some folks would be more impacted based on all the data that you shared before. And at our foundation, we had really been on this journey to really look at our data, right? So I think a lot of times as funders, we have these elaborate application processes, and we don't leave the capacity for ourselves to look at our own data to see who's missing, right? Whose voice is not represented, whose needs are not being tended to. And so on this slide, you'll see that during the relief fund, we were actually intentional about prioritizing renters. And so when you think about, we have these, wealth building conversations about home ownership and how do we close the racial wealth gap? But we also know that right now people's material conditions often require that they are renters. And when funders need to be educated about things like how federal funding flows, about who has access to that funding, right? And so off season, these are things that we could be doing, looking at our data and getting educated about how money flows, particularly because we know that many of our communities are going to experience multiple disasters, right? Back-to-back disasters will be coming our way. And so we knew that homeowners often get FEMA funding, are the ones who get the FEMA funding, and that renters are often struggling to figure out how to get their needs met because the homeowner has already called and filed the claim, and the renters are often left out. We also have learned through multiple disasters that when the homeowner often repaired the home, the rent would increase. And so the renter who was expecting to return to this place that they had called home after recovery would often not have that as a viable option. And so we were learning from previous disasters so that by the time we entered into the room with our peers, we were able to ask some questions and help move some dialogue forward around some of this. The same with income level, really looking at AMI and median income and what is the actual level of poverty in our community, right? So to your point, this federal poverty scale that we use is not reflective of what the true need is in our communities. And how do we look at existing data? United Way has data. Our systems have data. Our counties have data. Really partnering with existing folks so that we can be educated as we're having conversations was super important for us. And I think the last thing I would say about this is one of the things that we don't have on here is having some conversations about areas of town that we as funders had not been funding in, right? And so we had already been having those conversations at our foundation that even though we said we funded in this region, most of our funding was situated in Harris County and in the center of Harris County, And when we were actually starting to look at the data from some of our universities who were looking at mobility in our area, we learned many of the clients that our grantees were working to serve had moved outside of the city limits, or had moved from the city into unincorporated areas of town where we had not been investing in infrastructure and had not been really making sure that our funding was going to those areas.
Thanks, Kelly. And I know we're going to dive into geography a little bit later too. Now I want to follow up on this income level and Allison, bring you in, because this is one of the areas, as Kelly mentioned, we can look at addressing root causes. MoCaFi has done some work in basic income. So can you just tell us, what does that mean? What is basic income?
Thank you. So basic income, this is just regular cash payments to communities without any sort of means testing. And oftentimes this is used interchangeably with a guaranteed minimum income, which is means tested. And throughout the United States, we've seen a proliferation of guaranteed income pilots due to the work of former Mayor Michael Tubbs of Stockton, California. And so right now, whether you're in New Orleans, Birmingham, Madison, Wisconsin, Los Angeles, Chicago, you have cities and municipalities and counties that are working to address people's minimum needs. And we also have areas such as Cambridge, Massachusetts, which has instituted a guaranteed minimum income for residents. So it's based on their income. And so it's exciting to see this form from simply pilots into policy, because ultimately that's the goal. California is funding 2 guaranteed income programs specifically for foster youth. Representative Bonnie Watson Coleman of New Jersey has introduced a House bill calling for a guaranteed income. And a lot of times individuals, focus on, why are we giving taxpayer money sometimes? Although many of these programs are funded, obviously moving into policy would require levels of local, state, and federal funding. And so they say, well, they'll spend it on this, they'll spend it on that, they won't spend it appropriately, which I think, speaks poorly about how we view individuals who may be living at a certain income level. And so why guaranteed or basic income of some kind matters is because no one wakes up and says, I want to be impoverished, I want to struggle, I don't want to provide for my children, I don't want to be able to feed them or feed myself. No one says that. And so individuals who have received these funds, time and time again, we're seeing that they are paying for their needs, their utilities, their rent, food, childcare, whatever the case may be. So they're not out spending frivolously just because they're receiving these funds. They are taking care of their basic needs. You also have to realize that there are individuals who perhaps want to, take a few college courses, or individuals who want to do things, make small investments so that they can further their employment, so that they can provide extracurricular activities for their children. And so you have individuals who could, in fact, be moving out of certain income levels. You have, children and families who could be experiencing different things, but they simply don't have the money to do so. Also, it's important to remember that employment realistically requires money. If you don't have stable housing, stable transportation, if you're not eating regularly, sleeping regularly, it is very hard and sometimes nearly impossible to stay gainfully employed. And I think a lot of individuals may not realize that when we talk about housing first and making sure that someone can pay their rent, right? It's incredibly important, because if I, am relying on public transportation and I'm late because I'm using the bus and, I can't get there in time, numerous individuals have lost their jobs simply because they couldn't get there on time. individuals who don't have a permanent address to provide, when applying for jobs. So I think we have to remember that, yes, employment, we're working for money, but it also requires some money. Wealth can mean health. And at a very basic level, we know that individuals can sometimes forego, often I will say a lot of people forego healthcare because, they simply can't afford it. And of course, in the long run, that leads to numerous other health concerns. And so the cost rises as these health concerns aren't addressed. And although it's not seen, it's connected. We focus a lot on physical health, but also mental health. The idea that individuals are on a daily basis struggling to provide, that's traumatic. It simply is. It's stressful. The levels of, anxiety, depression, and other mental illnesses and mental health concerns among those living in poverty, it's obviously far greater than individuals who, are able to provide for themselves. So and that also includes children. It's a generational issue. So I think that's something that we really need to take into account when we talk about, how do we mitigate and address these things? Because that's a long-term investment. Individuals who are able to, effectively address their mental health, their physical health, those are individuals who can efficiently and effectively work and provide. Those are individuals who can, do all the things that we assume, folks receiving some sort of minimum income should be doing. And also a rainy day fund. Saving, if you talk to many individuals who have received some of these funds, has been a key factor. If I have money tucked away somewhere for a car repair, excellent. An unexpected bill, a healthcare issue, great. But also thinking in terms of, predictable disasters. Again, I'm from the Gulf South, so I certainly took for granted sometimes the ability, my family has funding, I have funding to, evacuate if necessary. Everyone doesn't have that. And it's, incredibly disheartening to see, and really just tragic to see how many people lose their lives, are just stuck, can't get their, children, those with disabilities everyone can't just leave. And so, finding ways to make sure that, people can save for those types of, at a level, again, predictable situations is incredibly important. And creating a universal basic income or some level of a guaranteed income can help contribute to those systems.
And I think beyond predictable, also, what do you have in stock for the unpredictable? You never know. We've had 24 tornadoes already this year.
Exactly.
So, how about in a disaster? How can cash assistance play a role there?
So, like I said, the first thing that I think of again is, how are you preparing for that? That's incredibly important. So finding ways to incentivize preparation for those who, it may not be on the top of their mind because they are focused on so many other things. You also have to think about, okay, you have individuals who are perhaps in a situation where they need to evacuate. Okay, there's the cost of evacuation, but then there's the cost, of course, of staying somewhere else if you don't have family or friends or you're not at a designated shelter. How long are you going to be in the hotel? How are you going to get food? How are you going to survive? You have to make the decision, okay, am I just going to leave and hope that everything's okay? When I worked for the city in my final month there, dealing with Hurricane Ida, it was very stressful. Hearing the stories of people who needed assistance, connecting with FEMA to get their hotels paid for. I worked with one family in particular who just was struggling, back and forth. They didn't know what, their home was flooded, if they should go back, if they should stay. That's that's all money, and having funds to be able to address that is incredibly important. And then, of course, post-disaster, finding ways to quickly, as Kelly mentioned, a lot of individuals are renters. So how do we find ways to, quickly get funds to individuals so that they can, in fact, find somewhere to say if the cost of housing increases, if their home is not habitable, how do we actually get funds to those people? I think it's also incredibly important to consider individuals, when we talk about something just generally, and I'm, speaking, with the US in mind, we talk about, refugees, asylum seekers, other individuals. And so we also have to think about how are we injecting funds so that we can make sure, for example, with food, that they can purchase things that are culturally appropriate. We are making sure that we allow people to maintain a sense of autonomy. And with that in mind, it's very important for the public sector and the private sector to come together to identify, how do we get funds to individuals pre-disaster? What are we doing to identify? We know where the at-risk. I was going to say we know where the at-risk communities are. So how do we get funds to those areas? In what manner? In a manner that makes sense, but also in a way that can effectively impact their ability to withstand not just the disaster, but also with a focus towards long-term recovery.
Yeah, I think for me, the most expensive thing after Hurricane Ida was restocking my fridge and freezer after 6-7 days without power. So Ashley, let me go back to you. PolicyLink does a ton of work with data. So how does data play a role in helping funders think about equitable disaster recovery?
Absolutely. First, I'm going to back up and then promise to step right into responding to your question. So I think all of us in this Zoom room really know firsthand that the concept of equity, especially racial equity, is under siege at the moment. So across the country, what is actually being debated is the notion that there must be winners and losers. What we're fighting about is whether or not the nation ought to serve everyone. And so I shared just a little bit about PolicyLink earlier. The short version is that we're a policy organization that's clear about our answer. Our nation, this nation, our democracy, economy, all of our institutions really do need to work towards everyone's thriving. So first, I just want to appreciate Allison's work on universal basic income and guaranteed minimum income, because those are examples of a real commitment to everyone's thriving. We've also decided that we just refuse to be distracted by debates about language. We're not going to get stuck in the trick bag that lets kind of our foes, our opposition divide us. We're going to really move to the highest ground to wage our fight. And it's really on this ground, this high ground, that we're fighting for everyone. And when we decide that we're going to fight for everyone, then we're well positioned to ask decision makers the most important question, which is, who will you deny? And so data, this is how I get back to data. Data ends up being one of the most powerful tools that we have to shine a light on unjust systems. And we use our data to show us who's being left out. So Kelly just used the example of homeowners and renters. And then we work at PolicyLink with those who've been left out to craft solutions that meet their needs. And we do that because we've learned over these years that if we build solutions for those most burdened, we actually are building solutions for everyone. And so the slide was just simply my reminder to share an excellent resource with you to consider, which is around the National Equity Atlas that our research team produces in partnership with Equity Research Institute at the University of Southern California. The Atlas is America's most detailed report card on racial and economic equity. And it equips movement leaders and policymakers with actionable data and strategies. That's my favorite part. It's got data in there, but it also lifts up, once you discover what's happening, when you have data that shows you the disparities in your community, it also offers proposed strategies to close the gaps there. And then we present equity metrics that are deeply disaggregated by race. And so just coming back to that frame about the all, if we stand on the all and then ask the question about who we will deny, then we can use tools like the Atlas to then point us directly to where those disparities are. And then the last powerful piece about how we use data is to ensure that on the back end, after we have introduced those solutions that we expect to close disparities, we can then look and see if our investments are actually making a difference in people's lives.
I think your point, Ashley, about it helps everybody is really just so important for us to think about. Kelly, I want to turn to you and build on this. So you started talking about geography, and during our planning call, you mentioned the arrow. So can you tell me what the arrow is and how did that influence your work at the Simmons Foundation?
Yeah, so this is not the slide for the arrow, but if you have it, great. If not, no worries.
Yeah,
So
if we can just, yeah, there we go.
Awesome. So time and time again, researchers in Houston have identified this arrow. And if you live inside of the arrow, you have more economic resources, you have better access to healthcare, you have you're typically going to be a homeowner or living in a beautiful swanky apartment. You are going to be well-resourced. The entire rest of our county is outside of that arrow and is disproportionately impacted by lack of infrastructure, not having access to healthcare, not having access to the best schools, et cetera, et cetera. And you can look at pretty much any data set around equity, whether that's environment, health, mental health, wages, et cetera, and every single time the arrow proves to be true. It's frightening, but it's very telling, right? When we say that where you live, the zip code in which you live determines a lot of your experiences, it holds true time and time again. And so when we were working on the disaster relief fund, we were really clear. We can't just focus on the arrow, right? The arrow is going to be good. The arrow is going to recover, and they're going to recover well, right? They're going to get the maximum FEMA because they learned how to reapply when they get denied the first time. They're going to have resources, whether that's family or their own, that's going to allow them to rebuild, raise their home, significantly increase their property value. Outside of this arrow was where we decided to focus our attention with a lot of intentionality. One of the things that we did was actually hold convenings as the members of the committee out in these areas, right? So instead of asking folks to come to us, we actually went out and had site visits with rounds of grantees to really hear and see what was happening with recovery. That's where we could see with our eyes that we had not been funding in a lot of these communities. And so it really informed our future grant making as we started to think about if we were going to be committed to equity and justice, then our resources had to reflect that, right? So if we are in fact committed to equity, equity is not equality. So equity does not mean that every zip code we are going to touch. We're going to identify the areas of town that have the highest need and the least investment in infrastructure, and that's where we're going to put our attention.
Equity is not equality. I think that's really important. And so you've just recently term limited it out from one of our, I know this is very sad for you, one of our co-sponsors for the webinar, Funders Together to End Homelessness. And, we know, and you've touched on that housing insecurity increases after a disaster. So what can funders do before or after a disaster to help change that? And Adrian, if you want to go back to the previous slide, and this arrow, like the other arrow, seems to be getting ahead of everybody else, but we can work with it.
Yeah, I really believe that trust and transparency is what is going to get us to transformation. So at the Simmons Foundation, we really spent a lot of time engaging with our grantee partners in really deep relationship building. We wanted our grantees to trust us enough to tell us when things were a hot mess, when they were having challenges getting other funding, when they had tried something and it wasn't working. And then the transparency was also really a lot about us being honest that when we did our CEP survey, even though we were a justice funder, 90% of our organizations were led by white folks, right? And so we were saying we actually don't trust leaders of color to run organizations and actually have good results. That's what our data was telling us. And so we were honest about what our findings were and that we were going to be making some changes to shift that, right? And so we were able to change our grant making so that by the time I left the foundation, we were actually more like 60 to 70% led by people of color in communities that were most impacted, right? That required us to build the trust with them. During our COVID funding, we brought our grantees together to talk about things that they were experiencing and seeing. We wanted them to have time to talk with each other and build that relationship. And that was what we were able to really use to shift. And so when we are working with our funding peers, it is also that, right? I'm not going to shade you because your organization doesn't use the right words, but I do want to partner with you to figure out how can we help you show up in some of these spaces? How can we help you make the case with your board to be able to do some of this work? Because we are all disaster funders, whether we call ourselves that or not. And if we can take the time to build the trust and be transparent and honest with ourselves about our limitations, our challenges, our aspirations, I think we can really move the needle getting towards more transformation.
Thank you. And I put some links that you shared with us in the chat for everyone. And you mentioned the Center for Effective Philanthropy Grantee Perception Report, and we'll share a link to that as well. It's something we've done, and it's just so critical, as you say, for finding out, are we doing what we think we're doing or trying to do as funders? So Allison, I want to move back to you. After a disaster, donors and individuals especially just want to donate stuff. And that's something in our field we call the second disaster. So why is it important to give access to cash instead of products that are unsolicited?
So as you can see on my slide, it's very clear. I touched on the question of autonomy when I was talking about guaranteed income. It's incredibly important to allow individuals and trust individuals to know what they need for their families and for their recovery. It's well-intentioned when, perhaps usually unsolicited donations come in of items that are not simply a cash donation, but cash donations are incredibly helpful because dovetailing into the second question, where does it all go? A lot of it is wasted, unfortunately. So, whether it's clothes, food, whatever it may be, it's wasted. And I think, cumulatively, all those wasted items, if you think about the dollar amount attached to it, imagine if we had just injected cash into that situation or had just donated to designated appropriate organizations. So simply put, individuals need to be autonomous. We need to trust people, and we need to be conscious of race, of waste. If individuals are not, if organizations have not asked for these things, consider another means of assisting. So I think it's very clear.
Yeah, and the thing that always stands out for me with this is also people need jobs. And so we need to invest in the business in the community to get people back to work. And so letting them buy at local businesses can really make a difference too. So we are going to go to the Q&A session after one more question. So if you haven't put a question in the chat, please, or in the Q&A, please do so. Ashley, let me go to you. Policy Link's Healthy Communities of Opportunity Work launched a Water Equity and Climate Resilience Caucus. So could you tell me what that is and why would it be important to center voices of people of color in that conversation?
Absolutely. Well, I talked earlier about this original design flaw of the nation. But given that flaw, it is sad, but it's absolutely not surprising that something as basic as access to clean water is still being debated in America in 2024. Um, and so at PolicyLink, we really believe that community voice and power are key to advancing equity. And so the Water Equity and Climate Resilience Caucus is just one example of that. The caucus was started in 2018 when we realized that there were no communities of color or low-income communities represented in federal policymaking spaces related to water or water access. And so we wanted to ensure that people who are experts and innovators on this issue actually get to shape the solutions that will directly impact them. And so I just wanted to share a couple of examples that demonstrate the importance of community-based leadership in policymaking through the caucus. The first example is the Low-Income Water Assistance Program. And so the pandemic showed all of us just how important clean and affordable water is to every family, every individual. So the caucus advocated and won over $1 billion in ARPA and federal appropriations funding for a temporary federal low-income water assistance program. And the program helps low-income households with water and wastewater bills. Well, our elected officials chose to do the right thing, but only for a little while. The program's temporary. It's another thing to watch out for in disaster recovery, right? And so one of the reasons why it's essential to center voices of those most impacted is because that's who exercises the most discipline, more discipline than the rest of us in making change. So in the long run, the caucus is really advocating for a permanent low-income water affordability program. They're advocating for a permanent solution because that's what's needed. It's what's just and fair. And that's really what the founding documents promise, right? And then one more quick example is the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. So $43 billion through EPA over 5 years. Well, many water advocates celebrated when the bipartisan infrastructure law was passed and these funds were included. But many of our movement partners were not excited at all because they had never benefited from the state revolving funds in the past. So for many of them, it felt like a big waste of time and effort. Well, PolicyLink is a bridging organization, and so we work on both sides. So we work with government partners, so the EPA's Office of Water, to reform existing programs, in this case, the state revolving funds. We organized a working session during which residents of California, residents of Michigan were able to speak directly with federal staff from the Office of Water about the challenges that they were having in accessing water. And then highlighting that these funds are really only just one part of a real solution to ensuring that everyone has water. And then we also work with partners to support this growing movement of water and climate justice leaders by anchoring the Water Equity and Climate Resilience Caucus. I want to be clear that we don't set the agenda ourselves. Instead, the members of the caucus, grassroots advocates and leaders lift challenges that then we all work collectively to address. And at the same time, PolicyLink does provide training and resources so that our partners can become more directly involved in the policymaking process. So in short, we support movement leaders to build policies that work. That's our preference, rather than just responding to windows of opportunity to reform policies that are problematic to begin with. And I just want to give one example of that still in this state revolving funds example. That legislation, in the legislation, states get to define what disadvantaged means when talking about disadvantaged communities. And then states also get to define affordability. So if you can imagine, we have legislation that can actually deliver to our people that are struggling the most, but then state officials can shift the definition to limit access, which is why I just go back to our preferred way is to just work with advocates from the beginning to shape the policy rather than have to fix it on the back end. Now, I shared all of that. Why does even that matter in nation? The big takeaway for this audience is that we need philanthropy to provide long-term funding to grassroots advocacy partners in season and out of season, after the disaster, before the disaster, because it really is, and this is part of what we missed in the Katrina recovery. There was a huge investment in grassroots groups in response to Katrina, but then we missed the opportunity to provide long-term funding that actually would shift movement action from responsive to proactive. It really is the difference between setting the policy agenda versus defending against negative impacts from somebody else's agenda. And then the last thing I'll just do, I need to celebrate Yasmin Zerpour, who brilliantly leads the caucus work on behalf of PolicyLink. None of any of what I just said would be possible without her leadership.
Thank you for calling her into the conversation. And we call that MIGOT, right? Multi-year general operating dollars. And it's so important to fund that. So we're going to move to the Q&A. And I'm going to go back and forth between questions that were submitted in writing and some of the ones in the chat. Kelly, let me start with you. I know you did some cash assistance during COVID. Could you talk about that and what that looked like? So a disaster setting cash assistance?
Yes, we were able to partner with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to do a pass-through grant from them. They were interested in supporting work on the ground. And so what we told them was that we're a justice funder. We want to stick with our justice priorities, and we believe that the organizations that we're working with are going to be those most impacted. So we had LGBTQ groups, we had undocumented groups, we had some abortion access work. We had some Black-led work that had already been happening in apartments in our community from previous disasters. And we reached out to our partners and said, listen, we got a chunk of money, we can give it to you. We want it all to be cash assistance, direct transfers, mutual aid. They all use different terminology, and we didn't want to be prescriptive on what that looked like, but we were interested in them being able to get cash out the door. What we've learned from folks is that when they can give cash, they can help prevent evictions. They can help folks do things like pay for burials and cremations when people pass away. They can keep folks together. Some of our youth homelessness work we funded at that time was helping stabilize young people who were living in our very robust motel population here. Because of affordability, a lot of folks permanently live in motels. And so there were 6, 7, 8 young people living together to keep themselves safe during the pandemic because they had nowhere else to go. We could keep them stabilized. And then as we were getting stabilized as a social safety network, help pay for down payments into apartments and other things that were more long-term. But the cash assistance was really game changer, and it wasn't without challenge, right? So we brought those folks together to talk about, what are you learning? We hate PayPal, gift cards work, we pay people directly. We were just learning so much by being in conversation with them so that they could help each other, right? We're not the experts on this work, but we want to get y'all together so that you all can support each other to try to troubleshoot and figure out how to get the cash out the door without all of the bureaucratic issues that can sometimes come with that work.
Thank you. Allison, I'm going to go to you. There's a question from Jeff Rubin. He says, for UBI or GMI, is there a way to assess a threshold between meeting immediate expenses and then also offering that long-term stability? You talked about that rainy day fund.
Yeah, so obviously a lot of the pilot programs right now focus on individuals who are of a certain income. They will often have benefits counseling. They will, assess needs. So I think it's, easy if you're looking at it from a pilot perspective to say, okay, this is where this individual is at the moment. And in terms of how we're tracking that long-term success right now, I'd say a lot of programs are again, with a focus on autonomy, you can, generally and anonymously track, spending to see what areas are being spent in. You may have some that are restricted, but, I think if policies associated with it, and depending on, again, what city, state you may be in, attaching, just tracking that success, and also being, quite frankly, intentional about working with these individuals, because yes, you want to provide these funds, and the goal is that individual not to be big brother and say, well, you better be doing X, Y, or Z, you better have this job, or whatever the case may be, but making sure that someone is actually, not just surviving, but is thriving as time goes on. So there's a lot of room to create those programs.
Thank you. Ashley, let me go to you, and you touched on this a little bit when you talked about the caucus, and Kelly touched on it with the grants. There's several questions we've received about trust and building relationships with communities that, really have a history and a reason to not trust philanthropy. So how can funders think about building those relationships before a disaster? And maybe if you know an example of a place that's done anything really well.
Mm. Two things come to mind. One is representation matters. And in this case, I don't just mean I'm going to be working in, with Black communities, and so I need a Black program officer. But even more specific than that, like I'm working in this particular community, and so it's important that I have a leader who is from that community, that knows that community, like that kind of representation. And even as a city official, I still chuckle at that phrase. It felt really important to me when we were focused on Black men. It felt important to hire Black men to lead that work. And even in our consultants, at one point we did a survey, so we hired Black men who had been left out of our workforce system and trained them as the surveyors to be in conversation with their peers. It wasn't just that we got more rigorous data, it was transformative for the surveyors, right? There's something about like, oh, I'm not the only one experiencing this. There are 38,600 other Black men in this city who are living the same experience as me. So, one is about, your question was about trust building. So part of it is about representation and really being precise in representation. I think the other thing, which is harder for philanthropy, is staying the course. I am privileged to be on the board of the Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation, who has been innovative since its founding in how we invest our resources. My favorite part of how we give resources is that it's long-term, general operating support over a long time, right? That's a trust building exercise, not just in the giving, but in the learning journey that we get to be on with the organizations that we support. And so those are the first two things that just come to mind about how to build trust. Is, I guess the theme in both instances is staying the course, but also just being willing to learn, acknowledge that we don't know, and then be willing to be on a learning journey with the partners.
We don't know what we don't know. So we need to wrap up, and I want to share a comment that came into the Q&A. It says, I don't have a question. I just wanted to thank these inspirational women doing essential work in equity to make the US a better and more inclusive place, which I really appreciate all of you for joining us today. And we've seen some other comments from the audience like that. So some next steps, if you're thinking about doing this work, as our speakers have talked about, address the root causes before a disaster. We are actually really involved in these issues usually. So health and food insecurity, education and poverty. And Kelly said, all funders are disaster funders, even if you don't think about it. So think about not just supporting those issues, but changing those issues. Build those partnerships, as Ashley was just talking about, and look at community organizations that serve these historically marginalized people. It does take time. So again, this is something to do before. And then use your funding to address gaps in government assistance and insurance so that we can look at all of those areas where we saw those disparities at the beginning. CDP is a place where you can find lots of resources. I encourage you to check us out. There's a list there, but disasterphilanthropy.org is your place to find all sorts of resources. We have a webinar again next month. We are back on schedule every month now. So beyond breaking news, local journalism's role in disaster recovery on February 8th. So I hope you will join us then. And, thanks to our co-sponsors. Thanks again to Allison, Ashley, and Kelly. Don't forget to complete our survey. This is how we can acknowledge our speakers and what they have taught us, but also for you to tell us what you would like to see in future webinars. If you have any questions that we haven't answered, you can email me. My address is there, tanya.gulliver-garcia@disasterphilanthropy.org. And thank you, and I hope to see you next month.